then hopefully we have some time at the end of my talk today. Okay, so I guess we start at the beginning and what makes a research project, right? So normally you would, in order to start a research project, you'd apply for funding, you have your proposal, and proposals take different shapes and forms depending on the funding scheme that you're applying to. And if it's an internal project, you may not even have a project proposal. So I think what's important really here is to start with as much definition of your project as you can, and to be very concrete about everything that you're planning on doing. In general, a lot of research projects, based on the nature of research itself, are not necessarily very clearly defined in the steps that they're going to take from start to finish, just due to the nature of research, because it's risky. We don't necessarily know where it's going. We have a direction. We know we want to explore a particular topic and we want to achieve something compared to what the state of the art on that topic is, but we don't necessarily always know what the steps are going to be from start to finish. And so it's very important, regardless of whether you start with a very clearly defined project proposal, which has a very concrete project plan, steps, milestones, work packages, and so on. It's very important every step in your project to have very clear objectives with clearly defined deadlines, so that essentially you or your team can execute on those, and then you can have a review after those are executed and essentially measure what you've done with respect to where you started and what your goal in your research project is. And so I think this is one thing that I have found over the last 10 years or so, where a lot of research projects potentially either thrive or fail. I find that if you start with a very high level definition of what you want to achieve, a very broad objective, and you don't continuously refine that down to very concrete steps and review your progress at regular intervals, generally you end up being in trouble. And so, as you can see here on the slide, generally, as you would expect, the inputs in a research project are, time, people, equipment, facilities, your project plan, which is very important. And then as an output, you generally will have intellectual property, whether those are ideas, publications, patents. You would have hopefully performed, if it's experimental research, some experiments. You would have collected some experimental results and potentially built some prototypes, either to enable those experiments or to essentially showcase your work. And so for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to try and touch upon all of these topics and what are potential pitfalls associated with them, and potentially how you could essentially navigate around those pitfalls. So time is probably the most precious resource in a project, and needs to be very carefully managed. And usually that process happens at the project proposal stage, but it's also something that needs to be reviewed all of the time, because things don't always go to plan. And in fact, I think a good rule of thumb is to assume that things will not always go to plan. And when you do your initial project plan in terms of deadlines and how much time different steps will take, you always need to provision for extra time for things going wrong. And generally what I try to do is I sit down and I estimate how much time a task would take if it were to work perfectly and everything went according to plan, and then essentially bake into my proposal or into my project plan something that's closer to 2 times that amount of time, in order to account for things like that. The other thing that's really important when you think about setting people deadlines or setting yourself deadlines for certain tasks and so on is to keep in mind that projects don't generally exist in isolation. And unless the people involved in the project are 100% dedicated to a single project, and even then, it's unlikely that this will be their sole focus. So what that means is you also need to account for things like context switch for people to really be effective. So I guess probably most people are familiar with what I mean by that, but the idea is that when you essentially naturally when you switch from one task to another, generally you would need some more time to get into it. You know, whether that's simply on a day-to-day basis, or if you're switching gears between different parts of a project, and so on. So time being our more precious resource and generally being limited, when you embark on something that comes with inherent risk, like a research project where you don't necessarily know what the outcome is, I think it's very important when you structure your work that you start with essentially with the riskiest part of the project, or what you consider to be the riskiest part of the project at the time. And what that allows you to do is to essentially allow yourself to potentially fail quite early in your project, and then be able to reconsider your project direction. So going back to that initial slide, another important ingredient of research projects are the people that are involved in a project, right? So essentially, in my opinion, that is the most is the second most important thing in a project. You really a project can really succeed or fail by how well people are capable of working together. And so some pitfalls that I've personally experienced related to that, and going back to the topic of time, is when you want to properly account in terms of your time management is related to people, is you need to watch out for things like holidays, unexpected leave. If you are recruiting for your project, then you really need to take into account that that is usually quite a long process involving many steps, and it does not always end successfully. So if you're starting a really large project and you're looking to recruit a number of people to work on it, then in an ideal world, you would start as early as possible to do that, and you would have baked that into your project timeline as well. And then, of course, the team being a crucial part of the project is if you are in a managerial position, then you really one thing that you should watch out for is how your team is doing, whether they have essentially all the tools at their disposal to really do a good work. And what that would involve on a more of a day-to-day basis would be making sure that people are have time to discuss any issues or any problems that they've encountered in their work, as well as making sure that there are regular times where people can get together and essentially catch up on project progress and exchange ideas, which is a very important topic and should never be overlooked. Is if you're dealing with a very complex project which involves multiple groups of people who are not necessarily based in the same place, I guess, just like the project that we're all working on here, it's important to have events such as this one where people can get together, talk about their work, or talk about, in this case, on how to approach their work, so that essentially you can foster cross-pollination of ideas, and you allow people to hear viewpoints that they're not necessarily exposed to on a daily basis, or not necessarily something that's part of their background. Moving on to the topic of equipment, right? So in particular, the research that I personally am involved in involves a lot of equipment because it's very practical research. It's experiment oriented most of the time, and so equipment usually plays quite an important role in everything that we do when it comes to research projects. So here, there's again a few things that you need to potentially look out for. So whether you're coming into already existing facilities where equipment's already available, or you're looking to procure that as part of a project, you need to keep in mind that potentially these types of procurement exercises can take a really long period of time. Again, I guess this is a bit of a recurring theme here. And depending on how, if you are procuring the equipment, how large potentially the amount of equipment is, then there are certain regulations stipulated in law that universities and other institutions need to abide by, which make this process quite complicated. So it's usually not as simple as essentially going to a website and ordering equipment. There are processes that need to be followed, and these can generally take a really long period of time. For example, I was recently involved in a project where we had to procure equipment worth several hundreds, thousands of pounds, and so that is an exercise that requires that equipment purchase to essentially go to tender, which is, for those of you who are probably familiar with this, is quite a lengthy process, and essentially can set back your timelines by several months. And that can, and depending on the duration of your project, can be quite crucial, and is definitely something that needs to be accounted for. If you are not procuring your equipment, then that equipment is already existing in a lab somewhere in your institution. And more likely than not, that's equipment that you would generally share with your colleagues or with other teams. And something that's I see sometimes not being accounted for in project planning and in research project management is that essentially that equipment is not always available to you, and you cannot just walk in and perform your experiments or make use of that equipment. Now, that equipment may not be available because other people are using it at the time, but it may not also be available due to routine things like maintenance, calibration schedules, and things like that. And so it's important when you're planning a research proposal, as well as planning your work as part of a research proposal, to essentially do the work upfront. Research who are potential users of that equipment, research when that equipment is available, is there any maintenance period coming up for it, or so on, so you don't essentially get caught out when you really need to use that equipment. And also very important is always have a plan B if your research project is heavily based on experimentation, or equipment plays a pivotal role there, in order to be able to account for things like equipment failure, or anything similar of that sort. So on the topic of equipment, I guess facilities are a very closely related topic. So when I speak about facilities, I mean sort of what you could maybe think of bigger pieces of equipment. So very specialized things, like, for example, if you're doing some sort of a project, let's say that involves a specialist experimental facility, like, for example, like a water tank. If you're doing, for example, underwater communication, something that I have some experience in the past, and some of you may as well. So you would potentially need to use something like a water tank, and so well, you again, you need to keep in mind that that those types of facilities usually are in high demand because there's not that many of them, especially if there's something that's cutting edge or requires a lot of capital investment to set in place. So again, do your research up front. Make sure that that facility will be available to you at the required times. But also keep in mind that specialist facilities like this generally also have other considerations in terms of health and safety and so on, that need to be fulfilled prior to being able to access such a facility. And these things, again, are very important and can take some time and may not be something that you would have experience with, so are again best tackled as early as possible. So if your research project is heavily based on experimentation, like the work that I, for example, do, then it's really important to, again, as part of your research project, to approach experimentation in a very rigorous and a very structured manner. One thing that that people sometimes forget is that even though you're performing an experiment today, you may want to repeat that experiment, 2 weeks from now, a month from now, or so on. So it's extremely important to take as much time to essentially document your process as much as you can. And essentially, I encourage everybody to take a level of notes bordering on paranoid. And it's more often than not that ends up being extremely helpful later on down the road, if you need to replicate an experiment and you need to do that in such a way that you obtain essentially the same results or within an error of a margin of error. Sorry, that's acceptable. Another thing that's important when it comes to experimentation is to keep your raw data that you capture from experiments, both from the point of view of being able to share that with other researchers, as that's becoming something that is required these days for reproducibility and judging reproducibility of experiments, as well as to allow yourself to essentially have the opportunity to post-process your data later on if you find either a flaw in your approach or you find a better way to do that. And again, as something in a similar way to what I've been talking to about so far is, again, it always pays off to do most of your work upfront, i.e. to plan and document your experiment before you actually do it, as well as discuss that with other people, whether those are people that are involved in your project or just people who have potentially more experience than you or have done something similar, in order to make sure that you iron out any potential pitfalls or any potential errors, or streamline your process, your experimental process, such that you can get the best results possible as part of that. And which brings me to the topic of prototypes. So most experiments involve some sort of a prototype, whether that's a very early stage prototype, which can take the form of essentially just a combination of benchtop instruments, something like waveform generators, oscilloscopes, or so on, or it's a much later stage prototype, something perhaps similar to what you see here on the slide, which is a more or less self-contained system. When it comes to prototypes, it's and essentially building them or before you use them. One thing that really pays off, and people don't always consider, is that if you can simulate the operation of your prototype, you should simulate as much of it as you can, in order to really understand its behavior, as well as to understand if something fails or something's not working quite right in your experiment, what does that look like up front? A lot of the time, experimentation tends to take a really long time because of troubleshooting, right? You set up your experiment, you turn it on, you start to record some data, but it doesn't make sense, right? Either something's going on in the experiment, or there's something that you did not consider prior to your experiment, or there was something simply that you've now discovered, because that's not an experiment that has either been performed before, or that you haven't performed before. And so doing a lot of this work upfront then can allow you to save essentially a lot of time, as well as create insight into what you're trying to either prove or demonstrate prior to you actually doing that, which can then essentially give you some sort of a feedback cycle where you can improve everything in a much shorter time frame before you actually enact it in practice. And when it comes in particular to prototypes, you should always plan that your first prototype will not be successful, because more often than not, it is not, or you find something that you could have done better that can significantly affect your results. So always plan that you would have to build at least 2 prototypes in order to account for things like that. And then when it comes to actually building your prototype, I always recommend that you build it in stages, which allows you to basically do troubleshooting and debugging for much smaller systems, especially if you're dealing with quite a complicated late-stage prototype. Debugging a subsystem, essentially, of your prototype is always easier, takes less time, and at the end of the day is a lot less frustrating for people. And so I think we are kind of coming up closely to the 30-minute time slot. So in summary, when it comes to research projects, these are maybe the 4 points that I've learned are possibly the most important, is to first of all plan as meticulously as you can, and try to define things as concretely as possible, and plan for the worst, and of course expect the best, and always allow for extra time with everything and anything, and a good rule of thumb that I use is to basically account for everything taking twice as long as you expect it to take. Try when you're planning your work, try to take the riskiest steps first, because that allows you to essentially potentially fail in them and have enough time to reconsider your approach and find a better way forward. And then always have a plan B. If you're especially dealing with a short research project, something that may be 1 year long, not say a 3-year project or something like that, it's always important to have a plan B, especially when it comes to facilities, equipment, or people involved on the project. If those people, even if those people are immediately available to start on the project, you never know what can happen, and so it's always a good idea, especially with short-term projects or ones with intensive, closely spaced out deadlines, to have a plan B, or maybe even a plan C, or more, in order to make sure that at the end of the day you are successful with what you set out to do. So hopefully there was something useful in there for most of you. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.